Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today's Monday, July 13th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, since the beginning, this show is and has been, is, and will always be 100% free to download. Even today on episode 609, 12 years in, can't believe it. The way I keep this thing going and I pay the people who need to be paid is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. I use the Patreon platform and I use an episodic model. So if you are interested in pledging your support, any amount is very, very helpful. On a per episode basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Will Dufresne, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hagman, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Joe Wilkinson. Thank you all so very much. All right, quick intro for this one this week. Today I had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Zoe Nyssa. She is an associate professor of anthropology at Purdue University, and she has a brand new book out called Rarities: Conservation Science in a Time of Unintended Consequences. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Zoe Nyssa. Well, Zoe, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about your new book, Rarities: Conservation Science in a Time of Unintended Consequences. And of course, there are many times of unintended consequences throughout the history of conservation science. But before we even dig into that, I would love to know a little bit more about you and your work and kind of how you got to the place of putting so much effort. And, I was going to say, I know how much work it is to write a book, but I still haven't done it. I'm wanting to do it, but I don't have the bandwidth to do the work because I speak with authors and especially scientists who are authors every single day about, about how much it takes from them. So let's get into maybe your work before the book first.
Yeah. I'll maybe start. I'll start actually in the present, which was, and then I'll work backwards. But when I finished the book and my tenure case had gone through, like that first, I don't know what, it was a Thursday or Friday night when the announcement came out. And I showed up in the living room. My family's watching TV, and I sit down, and they suddenly look at me, and they're like, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, "I'm watching TV." They're like, "You're what? You're doing what? Are you ill? Like, what's the matter with you?" And I was like, "This room is nice. I should sit in this room more. I should do this more." So I don't think I had sat in my own living room in front of the television in many years.
Oh man.
Yeah. So it's a warning, depending on how involved your book gets. But I had kind of a strange and winding road, and I think you'll appreciate this probably given your own biography. I started actually in astrophysics. And that was my first degree at the University of Toronto. And it was kind of like, the Canadian system is a little different. They've got kind of like almost this like extra duty major, like that's even more intense than a regular double major or something like that would be. And so I say it was kind of like a math degree, really, mostly. And the reason I did that was that space and science were really kind of my happy place. It was like, when people say, imagine a beach, feel relaxed, like at a yoga class or something. I was like, I'm not there, not on the beach. I'm looking up at the stars. I want to see the infinite,
Mm-hmm.
But as I was in that program, I kind of had all of these questions that I couldn't really answer. And I was finding myself at the library a lot, looking at like the origins of how the Greek figured out the number system, right? Or the invention of the zero, which was a big point in mathematics. And just how did people put things that happen into numbers, and then what's the fallout of that, because that allows us, that's really powerful. It allows us to describe certain things in a certain way, and it also takes away things. And so I had that kind of worry as a young person. And I had some professors who were like, you're okay at this writing thing. You seem pretty good at this writing thing. Can you write this technical manual for us? Can you join this project? Can you do these things? I started doing some kind of science writing for the student magazines and things like that. And they're like, you're actually asking these kind of really interesting questions. And I think physics may not be the path for you to answer those kinds of questions. And the final kind of breaking point was actually, I'm dating myself here, but the Hubble Space Telescope, a team came, and this was, at the time, there was a lot of debate around whether the universe was going to end, it started in this big bang. Was it going to end in a big crunch? Was it going to all kind of collapse back together or not, or keep expanding forever into this kind of cold, slow death? And they were using this telescope to do that. And these very, very smart, and lots of very, very smart, very prestigious people in the room, and I'm like in my early 20s, and they were making this very strong argument about the fate of the entire universe based on this graph, and the error bars so exceeded like where the measurements were, and I was like, I'm like 22, and this makes no sense to me. These people are sort of taking it seriously. Like if I did this as an undergrad, try to make this kind of argument, no, I would, my professor would fail me because I don't have enough data, right? And I didn't understand yet, because I hadn't taken a lot of philosophy or anything like that, that the fact that our arguments are really underdetermined by the data was not a concept that I had yet in my repertoire, but that was what I was kind of confronting. And I went, you know what? I looked around the room at all these people, and I thought that I need to understand this. I need to understand what the heck is going on here, and why this is happening. So I got my start there, but I started to move to the social sciences and starting to try to understand science itself as a system and as a social practice and as a community, and the people that are involved with science and that have a stake in science. So I ended up going to graduate school for that. Maybe the other part of my background that would be important to the way that the book looked is that I'm the first in my family to go to college. And when I was applying, my dad actually, he was here for Father's Day, so saw him recently, and he was like, yeah, I remember that talk that I gave you. He just sat me down and he said, people like us don't go to school. Wow. You're done school. You went to university, like you're done. You've already got one degree. That's more than anyone else has ever gotten. People like us go to work. You're smart enough, apparently. You're making poor life choices, but you're smart enough.
Making choices that cost money, not choices that make money.
Yeah, like go. It's time to go make some money. It's time to get a job. And he was convinced that by applying to graduate school in the United States, I think he thought I was going to be kind of like trafficked or something. Like he was like, they're going to take your passport away and like make you work or something. He just had no idea. And I said, I think they're going to pay for me to go to school, Dad. And he was like, no one pays for someone to go to school. You're like you're even dumber than I thought you were, kind of thing. So those two perspectives of having not had that in my background, to university as a thing to do, and then coming from a very different kind of scientific tradition initially, where you are supposed to be extremely quantitative and extremely objective, and the objects of study are literally light years away. Really shaped how I then started to encounter conservation, which was not actually what I was initially going to study, but I got this fellowship at the University of Minnesota, which has a really amazing group of faculty there, and it was with a zoo, and I was like, cool. I don't know anything about zoos. I mean, they're cool, right? But I was like, what am I going to do? I never even took any biology. Honestly, I escaped all biology in high school. I never took any of it in college. And my first time behind the scenes at the zoo, watching these scientists, these conservation biologists and veterinarians and all kinds of folks, and how they thought about their work and how much they really, really, really cared for their animals, their animal population, and were so invested in what their science was doing and why it was doing it, what it was for, that it astounded me. It was really, really cool to see. So that was kind of the kickoff many years ago to what became Rarities.
I love that. And it's funny thinking about me kind of sitting across the internet from you, actually, but sitting across from you and having this conversation, it feels timely in a lot of ways. The episode that will have aired, it's so weird when we podcast because we have to time travel a little bit, but the episode that will have aired the week right before this was an interview with Jessica Riskin, who is a historian of science, talking about Lamarck and evolution and sort of the zeitgeist of the time. And I just finished, just like very kind of serendipitously, a book by Lydia Pine, who I've also had on the show before, who's a historian and anthropologist, but specifically usually focusing on science, called Endlings, which is all about the last of specific species and how we tell stories about conservation and how we tell stories about species loss. And so I feel like I'm in this really interesting position where, even though this is not something I'm usually talking about and thinking about, it's sort of been on the tip of my mind lately, which makes me excited for our conversation. So tell me a little bit about, we got to sort of how you, I guess, chose your degree path and I mean, in a very meandering way. This specific story, like this book, Rarities, and the idea of talking about conservation science, but situating it really in the sociologic or anthropologic kind of landscape. What brought you to that storytelling?
Yeah, that's a great question. Also, I'm so excited for these other conversations you're having, because that's just great. I mean, back when I started this, conservation was kind of booming as a field, but the perception of it, I write about this a bit in the book, was that it was kind of vacuous, right? Like it was just a bunch of people on a mission to save the world, and who appointed them, who appointed you in charge, kind of thing. And in interviews, some of the very early participants in the very early meetings in the 70s and 80s, they would say, we knew we were here to save the world. Like it was on our shoulders to save the planet because no one else was. So they definitely came in with this sense of mission. And these were primarily, middle class white American male biologists with all of the social perspectives that come along with that kind of positionality. And by the time I came to the field, to study the field, it was well established, but still had this perception that it was kind of, what was it really doing? That wasn't it, because biology was the study of life. So what exactly was conservation doing? And initially I approached it like any good physicist. I was like, right, I need my initial conditions. I need to clear the ground here. I need to understand the entire field first, and then I'll figure out what case studies I want to look at, right? Because I was thinking I was going to do kind of a lab ethnography, as they're kind of called in anthropology. So take the methods of anthropology, but rather than apply them to a small scale society or a village, you would go to a laboratory and just hang out for a year or two with those folks and understand them and their culture. So initially I thought that's what I was going to do. And as I started to kind of move around the field and talk to different people and visit these different sites, over and over, I was getting these, I sort of say in the book, my weird file kept growing. These sort of strange stories people were telling me of stuff that didn't work out the way they wanted it to. A tremendous amount of like personal and professional hardship, people getting shut out of the field, people getting hacked, backlash, like just all kinds of things sort of happening to people, projects getting sabotaged by local communities, lots of corporate backlash, like just all these things that were happening that kind of got in the way of what seemed like it should be a fairly straightforward thing, and in some ways a fairly uncontroversial thing, right? Which is just like, let's protect the environment upon which we all literally depend, right? Like, let's
Yeah.
just not trash it completely, because it's where our water and our food come from. So I started initially thinking, let me just understand who's in this field, what they're doing, what's going on. But then very quickly it became this thing of like, whoa, there are these things going on, and how widespread are they, right? Like, is this, what is going on here? If the whole thing is kind of not always happening the way it was expected to, what does that tell us about science more generally?
Right.
And so by the end of it, I kind of was saying I was sort of writing, I mean, and it's in a weird way, kind of, I think of it as almost like a love story. Like, what happens when the thing you love, that you love the most of anything that you've sacrificed everything to love it and to understand it and to know it, and it's not working out the way you wanted it to.
Ugh, gosh. Yeah. Wow. There's something very kind of existential and almost like eschatological about that. I can't help but, my psychologist brain over here is like comparing that to this concept in mental health about like gripping things so tightly that they actually fall through your fingers. This like really difficult balance that we have of holding things softly and of being nimble in an effort to change course when things aren't working. I think there's so many things I want to get into with you, obviously, so many examples and stories of, as you mentioned, like times when there's an intentionality and almost the opposite happens, or there's just things that feel very controllable, have all these other unintended kind of runaway outcomes. When I think about this entire I don't even want to call it a field because it's so many different fields, but this entire area of even like inquiry and practice of how do we protect and save our planet from ourselves in a way, knowing that we are the arbiters and the actors, and that there are geopolitical forces and that there are, now climate change is like its own organizing force and all of these different things. I can't help but go back to, for listeners who have been listening to the show for a long time, you may remember that like several years ago, I traveled to Namibia to give a talk about science communication. And, we all have these memories of these times where our eyes were really opened, right? Where like we shifted our perspective in a major way. And one of the things that I learned there, working with the people who have their boots on the ground, the people who live there, who are from there, and especially in these like large sort of nature reserves where a lot of indigenous folks would live with wildlife, was the power of something like, and I hate to say it, but trophy hunting. Like this thing that I think historically as a white person living in the West thought was just all bad. And I very quickly learned that trophy hunting was how they fueled their anti-poaching patrols. And, trophy hunting was a tool that they used. They had a bull elephant that was knocking over a bunch of people's water. It was a burdensome animal. It was old. It wasn't breeding anymore. The people just wanted to kill it. Well, sell the tag to some rich white person from the West and make $200,000 or however much they go for now, and use that money to fund anti-poaching. Like, I think in my mind, poaching and trophy hunting were the same thing. And being there and learning that this complicated thing that feels bad was actually a source for very good. And a lot of these animals have to be culled anyway. And conservation is not as simple as these animals are endangered, therefore we have to protect them at all costs, because look what happened in Botswana. It just really opened my eyes to how complicated this all is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that care piece is so big, right? What drives someone, who presumably wealthy enough to have a lot of choices with their leisure time and how they spend their recreation money, but they're going to fly, a continent away and shoot something, and we don't tend to think of that as an expression of care. And one of the things I sort of argue for in the book is actually we need to think about those things as when you view it from a care lens, when you view it from a lens of this has real value, not just like intellectual or monetary value, but it has value for people in this deep kind of emotional way, this kind of connected way. That changes the equation. That changes a lot of our sort of philosophical ideas about ethics or how we think the economy runs or what is in our rational best interests as consumers, right? Like once you add that piece, it really opens up a way of understanding why people do the things they do.
Would you say that that is one of the kind of underlying themes, the takeaways that you were interested in communicating in this book? I mean, you did ultimately name it rarities, this concept of once something is scarce, once something no longer has ubiquity, it actually, in many respects, goes up in value, which becomes simultaneously detrimental to its remaining population and also incredibly critical for the work to, I guess, not see it go extinct at the rate, at least, like so many things are going extinct so quickly. Like this idea of what does it mean for something to be rare?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So that is absolutely the heart of the thing for sure, the heart of the book. So economists will often, and I have this when I give, talks, there's always an economist or often an economics student who will come up to me and say, yeah, well, as supply goes down, so this thing becomes less common, more rare, whatever you want to say, of course the price goes up, right? Because there's fewer of them. And non-economists and even some economists will confuse like that standard supply and demand curve, which is the total supply and the total demand in a market, right? It's not about an individual's intensity of longing, right? So we know this with a lot of consumer goods, right? Where we do these limited product drops and it's here now just for a little bit. It's a limited run. It's whatever it is. Sneakers, Pokemon cards, you name it. We've created artificial scarcity, and marketers have figured out very well how to create artificial scarcity in a way to drive up demand for it, right? So the intensity of someone's emotional attachment to something can increase with its rarity, right? But for economists, there should be a point when you think about sort of larger market dynamics where you go, right, this thing has become too expensive for most people to afford, right? It's like it's like the thing you want to or shoot, right? It's I'm going to fly across, to Namibia and shoot this bull elephant. Not most people can't do that. They don't have the resources. And so total demand across the market decreases.
And what I end up interesting.
Yeah. So what I end up talking about in the book is that what happens, and this was sparked by some talks that I went to. So these were biologists who were starting to identify that these things were happening. When something becomes valued just because it is perceived as rare. So I use the case of caviar, right? The study that was done with caviar. If people have a choice between a rare brand of caviar and a common brand, they did these taste tests, people will always pick the rare one because they want to seem like they're experts, right? Expert consumers, and they enjoy luxury and they can appreciate all these sorts of things. So all of these other meanings get attached to rarity. And if what the market is demanding is just rarity for itself, it doesn't matter which good it is anymore, it doesn't matter which species it is, then this becomes a real problem for conservation policy. And I argue for other areas of applied science as well, because people are now have this arbitrary demand for just this thing that seems special. And what is conservation doing except making things seem special? The whole point of the field was to make people care about stuff. And they did.
Yeah. Without, I guess, the foresight or, just the insight, really, that in some respects, you're right. Once something feels special, we feel it an extra emotional kind of drive to protect it, but we also feel an extra emotional drive to make sure that we have it, that it somehow is possessed. Like, put it in the zoo, put it in the, for conservation purposes, but like mount it, and I think obviously there is that colonial perspective does persist. I don't think it's as bad as it was back when we had like European sailors going around the world. Ooh, that's a cool thing. I should kill it so I can show everybody what it looks like. But it's funny thinking about, like, let's say a beautiful bird, for example, and the very reason it might have become rare would be because we killed it when it was ubiquitous to make pretty hats. And then you have other species who they're just sensitive to these, climate changes. They just don't have the resiliency. And it's not because anybody went, I really, really want that frog for myself. It's because that frog cannot adapt to a rapidly changing climate, and it's just dying.
Right. But often, like, even those, we used to sort of divide things into, like, but back before Riz was a word, right? It was like charismatic species. So like
Yes.
The high charisma species and the low. So the elephants of the world are kind of high charisma, and the frog is typically considered low charisma. But now you can kind of find fandoms for almost everything, right? And even a plant, right? There are plant collectors out there who want whatever the thing is, and because of the internet, they can get it. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was dining clubs. I wanted to eat the zebra. I wanted to, that was these gentlemen's clubs. They would serve like zebra meat or whatever. It isn't always even species based. So one of the chapters in the book, I look at a housing development in Texas that is adjacent to a preserved area. And everyone that lives there describes themselves as a nature lover, right? They all really, really, really love the outdoors. They really love and see themselves as stewards of the land in different ways. And they hold different, social positions and political commitments, but they all had that in common, right? They moved to this place because they loved the outdoors. They wanted to be around nature. Even if they weren't going to go hiking in it or whatever, they wanted to be able to see it outside their window. And that also can be a problem, right? So when we protect an area, if we're then incentivizing people to develop all along the margins, and there's been a lot of really interesting research that has found this happening globally, so not just in the United States, that once you protect an area, you're basically saying to everyone else, this is now preserved from development. We're never going to build a highway or a housing development or mall, or nothing's going to come, chip manufacturing plant like we have here locally. And so if you now build adjacent to it, you've got a guaranteed access to this undeveloped space.
Yeah.
And so it incentivizes a different kind of consumption. It's not a consumption of like caviar or something, but it's by sort of having that land become privatized, you've converted it into a kind of a private consumption dynamic all along the perimeter of that protected area.
And that's probably, would you say that ultimately, it's hard to kind of know somebody's intention, but that is a sort of perfect example of these unintended consequences where the idea is, noble. It seems like it's guided in the right direction. And yet, this was probably always destined to happen.
Right. And the big kind of shocker in doing the research for the book was that scientists knew this. So early, ecology was kind of founded as a discipline in the late 19th century. It sort of came to the United States and organized itself in the early 20th century. And all the way back then, so over a century ago, they knew that this could happen. They knew that this could happen, right? So they were already worried about setting up the first national parks, the first protected areas, aside, notwithstanding the massive displacement and land theft from indigenous landholders, but the idea that we could create an amenity out of protecting things could make it enter sort of these consumption dynamics as well, was something that people knew about a century ago and were worried about. But they didn't have good solutions for it. The solutions were things like, let's keep this secret. Let's keep it just among the scientists, or let's not publicize it or whatever. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that never works, right? The secrets always get out. And when people complain now about how crowded the national parks are, or how crowded their favorite spot is, or don't put this on the internet because someone's my favorite spot's now gonna get too crowded. That's the same sort of thing at work.
It's interesting. It goes right back to this concept of rarity as well. Yeah. And I, the other thing that I think I picked up in some of my travels and some of my sort of like education was this concept of, I think a lot of people in the West who think of like, when you mention charismatic species and we mention, or we think about the concept of wilderness or of something being wild, one of the things that I very quickly learned when I was in Southern Africa in a country that's like the second least population dense country in the world that has all of the charismatic megafauna, they've got the big five, they've got all of these like phenomenal animals that a lot of Westerners grow up only seeing in like children's books and like in the form of stuffed animals. I think the thing that I very quickly learned was wild is an operational definition. Like, yes, these are wild animals, but none of this land is not managed. Like all of these areas have fences, and most of these large animals are tracked and they're either collared or tagged. We know their names. We're watching their movements. Like people are tasked, whether they own the land or whether they're on a land lease or whether they're working for governmental or NGOs, they're tasked with ensuring that, okay, there aren't too many giraffes in this area. We need to cull some of the giraffes so that the balance is correct. And I think that was really eye-opening for me, that even the concept of like, just let it go to fallow, let it go wild, let it go like to the wilderness. What does that even mean anymore?
Right, exactly. And I think that's sort of the concept of the Anthropocene, right? Like that we're living on a planet that is so shaped by human choices and human activity that it's hard to even find places or find what we used to think of as natural processes that are not in some way touched by humanity. And I think that a lot of people are grappling with that. I mean, that's where a lot of grief for a lot of people comes from, is that they want that idea of the wilderness, especially in the United States, right? We're sort of based on this idea of the frontier. And now maybe it's space or, a
you're so right.
colonization or something.
But it's always been a lie, right? Like, yes, it was quote unquote wild, but there were people there. Like there were people there who did affect the landscape, maybe not clearly not to the extent that we do. Maybe they were able to figure out a way to be less destructive, and it became a part of their ideology and their religion over thousands of years. But regardless, there was not a place. I mean, there were a couple places. Iceland, weirdly, was a place where there just were no people. But there's very few places where there were no people, indigenous people, kind of figuring that out for themselves before we just kind of... Jesus Christ, the royal we, the West, like you said, manifest destiny, sort of like moving west for gold mining and for opportunity and for space and for land, and saying, oh, we're going out to the wilds. It's like, no. Maybe it's more wild than what you're used to, but...
And a lot of what we took to be wilderness, right? There's a lot of archaeological and other work that's pointing to, these closed canopy forests and things like that are actually a symptom of indigenous genocide, right? So once we lost those original caretakers, the land changed. And then when people colonized the Americas, they go, oh, this was our baseline, right? So these scientists, these ecologists in the early 20th century are looking backwards. They themselves are going, things have changed so much, and they're very anxious about it, right? It's the Gilded Age, it's Industrial Revolution, as all this sort of stuff has been happening, and they go, man, the landscape has changed so much. What did it originally look like? And they point back to that time period, but that time period is actually the output. It's the product of a prior extinction of indigenous peoples and species. Yeah,
it's pretty amazing that I think there is a sort of tendency, and I mean, there's probably like some just fundamental like anthropologic cognitive biases at play, but this tendency to say how far back do we go as a purity test, right? At what point was everything untouched and pure? And it's like, you kind of have to go back to before there were people. But if you go back to before there were people, the landscape was wildly different anyway. We were in a different geologic era, like everything was different. And then once people are on the scene, okay, you may be able to argue, I suppose, that there was a long period of more harmonious relationships with nature. But again, these are all constructs, aren't they?
Right. Yeah. And, a lot of what I ended up grappling with in the book was that, okay, these scientists had a concept of modernity, right? So this modern era, again, think Gilded Age, early, 20th
Mm-hmm.
century, jazz, all these things are sort of happening, boom times, lots of hardship for economic underclasses and racial minorities and for women and recent immigrants, but also like this incredible wealth generation that's coming out of industrial activity. And
Mm-hmm.
scientists are starting to go, what is that? Okay, if I'm an ecologist in this new science we're calling ecology, which is going to be the science of, so if biology is the science of life, we're going to be the science of how life develops in its places. So it's the science of biology in its environment. We're going to look at the organism and its environment in terms of its relationship. And other early scientists said, you people are insane. That's nonsense. You can't possibly do it. It's too complicated, right? They don't have computers yet. Even now, we have all these computers and we still can't do it very well. But
Yeah.
they were like, there's no way you can possibly do that. That's a terrible field. And some of them actually warned their students not to take ecology. They were like, it's going to ruin your mind because it's not based in science. It's too complicated to ask these questions. We need to ask much more narrow questions like, can I dissect this heart of this frog or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and leave all these other pieces out of it. But these early ecologists were sort of looking both at what was happening socially and politically, and combining that with a lot of the early discoveries they were making and going, man, modernity is sort of built on our concept of what's modern, what's scientifically and socially sort of progressive and new and contemporary, is built on this separating ourselves from nature. That's the whole idea of a city, right? A city is like
Yeah.
the ultimate arrogance. It's the ultimate human
Yeah.
hubris. And these cities are expanding all over. And Chicago was one of those places that I talk about in the book because it was a real birthplace for things like sociology, so the Chicago School of Sociology, but also for ecology as well. And Chicago as a city was this sort of laboratory for urban landscape and urban design in a lot of interesting ways. So lots of people were coming to that area to sort of ask those questions of what does it mean to be a modern human? How far can we separate ourselves from nature and kind of get away with it, basically, right? And if I'm modern, what makes you not modern? Because you're too close to nature, you're too rural, maybe. Your livelihood is based on the land, right? You don't live in a city. Maybe your skin is a different color than mine, or you speak a different, language, you live in a different place. So you're not modern, but I'm modern, right?
Right.
And science, ecologists were in a tough spot because they needed to be a modern science in order to get going and get funding and get established in universities. And yet they also saw the contradiction there, right? Because they went, the more we become this modern contemporary science, more objective, more quantitative, the further we sort of buy into this false premise, right? That we can separate ourselves from nature.
Yeah. So I can't help but think about, I don't know if you've ever seen this cartoon there's an author named Daniel Quinn who was, I don't know if it was like quite sci-fi, but sort of a lot of environmental criticism and interesting, I don't know, whatever, tribalistic stuff, but like a cultural critic. And he did this cartoon that has always really resonated for me. And it's called The Fence. And it's just 4 cells. And in the first cell, it says 8,000 BC, and it's like a lush world with a tiny little fence on the corner. It says, we call it a
Yeah.
fence. It keeps out the giraffes and the lions and the elephants. And then AD 1500. And then it's like the fence is halfway across the world, and it's like barren on one side and lush on the other. Pray for rain, children. And then like 1800, it's like more of the world is barren and there's more green inside the fence. And then it ends with, now the world is all brown. There's a tiny fence with a little green. And it says, we call it a wildlife preserve. It keeps in the giraffes and the lions and the elephants.
Yes. Okay. I have not seen that cartoon, and I definitely need to.
It's
Because that's
phenomenal. Like, right? It just
yeah.
taps, and when you see it, and it just okay. It lays it bare. But that is the world we're living in now, and it's because of this series of choices.
Right.
But were these choices? I mean, I often struggle with this. I mean, who cares? Because it's an unanswerable question about like inevitability or choice or whatever. But the very core concepts of like capitalism and how quote unquote progress is defined were at a time anathema to this concept of conservation. I guess clearly they didn't have to be, but the people with the power and the purse strings, they just didn't have the insight or they didn't care.
So in some cases, I think the insight was there, but it
Okay.
couldn't be acted on. And this was sort of part of
Ah.
the, I guess, counter history, or some of the stuff I tried to recover a little bit
Mm-hmm.
from the archives, from the archival work, and put into the book, that there were these voices all along saying, maybe we shouldn't do it this way. Maybe we
Mm-hmm.
shouldn't cast our fortunes in this particular way and fence everything up and try to protect it in this way. And maybe we need to consider how humans care and are in interrelationship with their environments, and have been forever, right? And those people were explicitly kind of pushed out or told no at multiple
Mm-hmm.
points. So I sort of document that in the book. Like, okay, here was another time. Here was another time where people said, someone tried, a few people tried even to say, we need to have a much more, as complicated as ecology is for thinking about life in its relationship to place, it'll be even more complex once we start thinking about place as a human geography, as a social geography as well. But if
Mm-hmm.
we don't do that, right, we're kind of doomed.
Wow.
And these folks would sort of say, nope, ecology is only going to be about non-human species, right? Conservation is only going to be about the non-human world. And what we're going to do once we figure out what is happening in the non-human world is we're going to tell the humans how they should behave, right?
Yeah, because that always
And
works.
that
Yeah.
works. That works so well.
I can't help but just feel like it's a recapitulation of this ongoing theme of othering, this ongoing theme of us versus them, which has always landed us in the most cooperative of situations. Like it reminds me quite a bit. I remember having a conversation with my mother once. This is going to feel like it's very off out of left field, but hopefully your brain works similar to mine and you see the
Okay.
correlation. I remember having a conversation with my mother once, and she was talking about a friend of hers who has a daughter who's trans, and she was saying like, "Oh, I'm just really proud of my friend because she's really coming around lately, and she's been inviting her to more things, and she's been using her pronouns." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, let's be so proud of this mother for accepting their child as they are finally." And my mom was like a little taken aback. She was like, "Well, it takes time for some people. And, we really grew up in a different era." And I'm like, while I appreciate that we can look back, let's say at scientists or at individuals and situate them in their time, and while I appreciate that there is normativity of things like racism and gendered violence and things like that, it doesn't mean it was okay even then.
Mm-hmm.
And I
Yeah.
always struggle with that concept. Like, it was still immoral just because more people did it out loud doesn't. And there were always people throughout all of human history saying, this is not okay. It's just their
Right.
voices weren't the loudest voices at that time. That does not excuse bad behavior in the past, because there were always people who recognized bad behavior, called it out, and said, we can be better.
For sure. For sure. And in some ways, the early 20th century was actually, at least for science, was a lot better of a place to be than it was decades later, right? There was this real sort
Yeah.
of closure of things that happened, post World War II, and sort of in the middle part of the 20th century, where things, it became very, very difficult to be a woman in science. It
Mm-hmm.
became very difficult to do certain kinds of work within science. And it's really kind of, for me, it was quite fascinating to go back to the early 20th century and go, man, these folks were so radical, like in ways that I wasn't expecting. And that certainly, I can't say that my original discipline of physics was certainly not like that in the early 20th century. But ecology it was this very experimental, very open field that welcomed a lot of people into it in ways that changed actually once it became kind of more attached to universities and became kind of an academic field by the mid 20th century.
I can't even imagine how, I'm curious about your process. I don't know how many people listening have the same type of curiosity that I have. I know sometimes we go to podcasts to hear stories. And while I do want to hear some of the stories, I also am kind of like, read the book. They're in there, that's the whole point, right? Like read the book to get the stories. But I'm really curious, how does one sit down and say, I'm going to write a book about this thing that could be literally thousands of pages and still never be finished? Like, how do you even choose? It's such a big concept,
Yeah, I had many, many, many people say to me, advisors, mentors, many people tell me, don't do this book. Don't do this book, actually, because it's too much. And especially as a PhD student, they were like, you're not allowed. We won't allow you to do this. It's too big. And I sort of mentioned this at the end of the book, but that my very, very end of field work, I was in a really bad accident. I was actually on a bicycle, a borrowed bicycle from the folks I was renting the house from, and I was on my way to a field site, and I was hit at a high speed by a truck that came up behind me.
Wow.
And as I was riding in the ambulance, actually, as I was laying on the pavement even, I was like, man, I don't know if I'm going to make it through today. And what a shame that I didn't do the work that I know I could do. You know what I mean? Like that this is actually the story that needs to be told. And if I can't tell it, someone else is going to have to, just this needs to be out there. Yeah. And so that kind of shifted things for me to kind of go, you never know when your time's up. You never know how much time you have. And so you ought to do the thing that you feel that you can do and that you want to do, rather than
did that help?
Everyone was telling me.
Yeah.
It did.
So once you had that perspective, it's still daunting, right? But did it give you a little bit of just like almost, I don't know if you could put your finger on it, but internal filtering that said like this over here, but not that over there. I need to focus like on this component right now.
Yeah. I mean, it helped me. It helped me hone in on, if you've only got, we all have finite time, right? But none of us know how long we have.
Yeah, we're all going to die. This is something I grapple with in my day job all the time. Yeah.
So what do you really, really, really have to say? What do you really have to say? And who do you have to say it to? What was harder was the figuring out the structure of it. So the book is written as I retell the same span of that century from the early 20th century to roughly the present in every chapter, right? I go over it from a different perspective. And once I kind of landed on that as the kind of the way to approach the writing, things got a lot easier. Because then I was like, okay, I don't have to talk about everything. I had kind of the same problem ecologists have, which is everything is connected to everything else. So how can I possibly write this in a linear way? And I'm talking about unintended consequences, and unintended consequences as a framework only makes sense if you think in a linear kind of way. If you think holistically, one of the things I argue is that none of these are actually unintended and none of them are consequences. So they're neither actually. But how do you make that argument in a book where every word has to follow every word? And so it still has to be linear.
Right.
So that part that part of the puzzle did take a long time to figure out.
Did you work from sort of a bottom up perspective of like, here's all this really interesting information and I need to piece it together to tell a story? Or did you work more top down and say like, these are the themes that I really want the readers to walk away with and kind of approach everything through that lens?
I would say I'm like a very optimistic outliner. So I definitely had outlines for what the book was going to be and plans. And then as I would write, it never kind of went Totally as expected. So there's that. I did definitely try to confirm the the case studies that I had accumulated through a large kind of meta analysis of the literature that had been published to date, because I really wanted to understand like how widespread is this phenomena of unintended consequences? How often do scientists talk in this way? Like, am I being mean and picking out the worst of the worst here, or
Hmm.
how kind of pervasive is this? So I did definitely do that kind of work to make sure that I felt okay about saying actually these are widespread, and it is systemic, and it's inherent to how the science has been set up and funded and organized. And we that means the good news is we could do it differently, right? So I kind of end
Right.
the book with we could organize science a bit differently here, and we need to, right? We're in a moment of real reckoning around what the role of science is in society. So
It's we talked a little bit at the very beginning, and maybe this is a good sort of bookend here, but this concept of what it means for something to be rare or to have become rare, and how it affects human behavior, and how there is a real chicken and egg question that sort of exacerbates itself, or like kind of runs away in a feedback loop. I'm curious what some of those, as you were sitting down to make those outlines, sure, a lot of that work is logistical work. How do I fit this in? How do I fit that in? But as you were thinking thematically, and you were thinking more top down, and you were thinking more like, what is the purpose and point? What do I hope that a reader can walk away with a deeper insight into? I'm curious, are there any themes that we haven't even touched on so far in our talk?
yeah, I mean, so the I don't know if this answers your question exactly, but each
Mm,
chapter, I sort of approach it the way an anthropologist would approach anything, right? What do groups of humans have to do together? They have to find ways to be safe. They have to find ways to not kill each other. They have to get along
hmm.
somehow. So that means they have to organize themselves and have norms, patterns of behavior that are acceptable and unacceptable. They have to uh, find a way to raise their young, educate and raise their
Hmm.
young, and they have to find a way to uh, produce or shape their environment. And all of those are things that all human societies have to do, but they're also things that science has to do, scientific disciplines have to do. They have to find a way to train their young, teach them what's right and wrong, acquire resources, whether that's funding or something else, defend their space against incursions, right? Whether that's their
Hmm.
methods or their way of working, and and leave things a little bit better for the next generation. So when you approach disciplines that way, some things start to make a lot more sense also, right? Like that these scientists had to invent field sites, had to invent this idea, produce their field sites. So they weren't just like discovered out there. Like you were saying about wilderness, it's not just sort of out there.
Hmm.
These ecologists had to solve a primary problem, which is what is my field site? And if with all this environmental destruction happening, which was happening even in the early 20th century, is changing my field site. So they knew that things like air and water pollution were changing their field sites. How can I study something scientifically? Because nothing's held constant. Everything that
Right.
I'm doing is in flux. So a lot of this was motivated by I have to create, if I'm going to create this field of everything, of life in relationship to absolutely everything else out there, including other organisms and the environment, then I have to have a way of protecting these field sites in order to do this work. And so that initial kind of that was the initial impetus, right? That was that care motive, if you will, of they
Yeah.
really cared for their field sites and they invested tremendously, a tremendous amount of labor and thought into the creation of these field sites and their maintenance. And one of the concerns right now is that a lot of those field sites are under increasing pressure again, right? Funding pressure and
Yes.
development and all kinds of things. So
Y- Yeah, I mean, it, I sort of just like as a second to last note, it makes me think about, when we think about perspective shift and paradigm shift within different scientific areas of inquiry. There are so many variables at play that often fade into the background. And that's why I think that, history of science, philosophy of science, sociology, anthropology, all of these fields are so fundamentally important to telling these stories, because nothing happens in a vacuum. You just described such a beautiful example of the zeitgeist, or the shifting zeitgeist throughout this type of work. And it's things like, what tools had been invented? And do we need to take the time now to invent a new tool to be able to answer this question? Was there geopolitical conflict at the time? What was the economy like? Were we in favor with whoever the prevailing, governmental structure was? And it's so interesting that we often just look at an outcome instead of looking at all of the different pressures that collectively tell a story. And of course, I think anybody living today can see that today is also history, right? And whether you define it as like a more trying time or not, we are living in a time of our own pressures on these areas of inquiry and on this very noble work to try to say, how do we protect, maintain, conserve, improve, however you want to define the goal. It's not just happening in a vacuum. It's happening against a background of all of these different pressures.
Right. It absolutely is. And people are responding with memory of what they did before or what happened before, right? It's not like people are a blank slate. So the first people moved to that community in Texas because of the views. The next group moves in because the swimming pool's there. The next group moves in because the grocery store. Now there's a grocery store, right? And so these things keep happening on top of the things that have already happened. And science is very not set up to handle that kind of long-term work. Someone trained in the sciences and someone who studies the sciences and consults a lot now for different science organizations. It's just not very, we have a very inadequate tool set to do that kind of long-term thinking about how consequences unfold on top of consequences unfold on top of consequences. We don't have a good language for that.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think, and even so, I think science still probably does it better than politics does because of just because of the nature of election cycles. It's very hard to think about long-term future when the people who are in power are thinking about getting reelected, or they're thinking about what they can do within 4 years. That really changes the calculus. So I have to ask, last question, because I know you have meetings to go to, but I'm super curious, the before and the after. I know that this has really been a large part of your life's work, but before you sat down to really, I guess in a meaningful way, write this book versus after, how have you been changed by your own scholarship, like by the things that you discovered in doing research and in doing interviews in order to write this book?
Wow, that is a great question.
Because I can't imagine you went into it with all the same perspectives that you came out of it with.
My goodness, no, I did not, for sure. I mean, I teach a lot of these same methods now to our wonderful sets of students here, and I do consult and work with a number of organizations around this. And one of the things I sort of tell them is that it feels really hard because this work is really hard. It's very, very hard to hold all of these things in a state of play at the same time. And so some of that work that I do now and that I definitely prioritize more in the work that I do, and that I also try to sort of teach and share, is that take that deep breath, right? Like this work is very hard. And if we come in with the boxes, we come in already with everything set up and we think we know what we're going to be doing, we're going to be really wrong, right? We're really foreclosing ourselves to a lot of potential insight. And so I actually start the book with this moment as a grad student where I'm completely wrong about something. I go and see this talk about the caviar and how Rarity is creating more demand for Rarity. And I'm like, oh, there's a simple solution here. We just need to fix the policy, so it says, Zoe as a grad student. I was completely wrong, right? Like that was totally not going to work. But it wasn't until I kind of stopped and allowed all these other things to kind of speak and not rush in for the answer that those other things started to emerge. So I tend to work very sort of slowly and a little bit sideways, like allowing a lot of serendipity to happen. which is very frustrating for students, right? Because which makes sense because they're like, I want to just, what's my research question? How do I do this? Let's get out of here. And in the graduate class, we've got a formal agreement with local government here. So we do projects every year based on what the community needs. And so they walk in the first day and they're like, what's our project? And I said, I don't know. We're going to build it. Like, how do we know? If you knew what people needed, why would they need us to be there to help them? We're there to figure out what people, help them figure out what they need. If we knew what they needed, then we're part of the problem, because now you're coming in as an outsider telling them what they need. So we're actually going to spend half the semester figuring out what the project is. And that is always very distressing, right?
But that's so important. You're so right. If we knew what they needed, they wouldn't need, because we would have already been solving the problem. Clearly, that's not how science works. But it is, I think, the hubris that has historically plagued many, many endeavors. And so what a beautiful and humble and incredibly frustrating and probably very probably directly attacking your self-efficacy at times, but necessary process for yourself and your students. And I think we can all, that's why I like to talk about process. I think we can all learn from that. We can all sit in the unknown a little bit more and work on our neuropsychological humility a little bit more, and stop assuming we already know and seeking out data that reinforce our previously held beliefs. Like, be aware that confirmation of bias exists and allow ourselves to sort of be more open as best as we can. I think wiser words have not been said. I can't thank you enough for being here. Everybody, the book is Rarities, Conservation Science in a Time of Unintended Consequences by Dr. Zoe Nyssa. Zoe, thank you so, so much.
Thank you. This has been a wonderful conversation. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.